Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My world is a circle of gray. Gray sea, gray sky, and the flat, battleship gray of the steel deck beneath my feet. For 6 months at a time, this circle is the entire boundary of my existence. I am a marine engineer on a supply vessel that services the oil platforms of the North Sea, a floating steel island that is a lonely, violent satellite to other, even lonelier, steel islands. My name is Stellan, and my life is a ledger of pressure gauges, engine temperatures, and the slow, relentless accumulation of days spent away from the sun. The work is a brutalist poem written in diesel fumes and rust. It is a constant, screaming roar of machinery that seeps into your bones, a vibration that you feel even in your sleep. It is the perpetual, damp cold that no amount of clothing can truly keep at bay. It is the smell of salt and metal and human sweat, a smell that becomes your own. It is a world without softness, without color, without the gentle, forgiving rhythms of a normal life. A man does not choose this life. He endures it. He endures it because the numbers in the other ledger, the one that gets wired back to a quiet, sunlit world he can only remember in faded photographs, make the sacrifice quantifiable. Make it in the cold calculus of responsibility worthwhile. My sacrifice had a name, and that name was Cora, my wife. She was the reason for the gray. She was the color in my memory, the warmth I carried in the cold engine room of my heart. Her image, a slightly worn photograph tucked inside my locker door, was my shore, my harbor, my one fixed point in a world of heaving, indifferent water. Her face, with its frame of dark, wild hair and eyes the color of a calm sea, was the map that gave my long, empty voyages a destination. The reason for my exile was a debt, a vast, crushing weight that had been the unspoken third party in our marriage from the very beginning. Cora was an orphan, her parents taken in a car crash when she was just a teenager. They had been artists, dreamers, people who had lived a life rich in experiences but poor in financial planning. They had left her with a legacy of love, a portfolio of beautiful, unsellable paintings, and a mountain of debt from a failed business venture, a debt that the bank, with its cold corporate heart, was determined to collect. When we married, I had inherited that debt. It was a dragon, guarding the entrance to the life we wanted to build. A quiet house, a garden, children, all of it was on the other side of this monster. So I had gone to war. I had found this job, this brutal, lucrative, soul-crushing job, because it was the only weapon I had that was powerful enough to slay that dragon. For 8 years, I had been sending the dragon its tribute. Every 2 weeks, the bulk of my paycheck, a number that would have seemed like a fortune to the man I used to be, disappeared from my account and reappeared in hers. She was the quartermaster of our war, the one who managed the logistics of our survival on the home front. She was the one who dealt with the bank, who paid down the beast, one small sacrificial offering at a time. Our communication was a lifeline, a series of emails and satellite calls that were always a day late, a signal that had traveled across 1,000 miles of static and seawater. Her emails were my scripture. She would describe the small, mundane details of the life I was fighting for. The leaky faucet she had finally gotten a plumber to fix. The funny thing our neighbor's dog had done. The progress of the tomato plants in her small container garden on the balcony of our cramped apartment. These small domestic dispatches were my oxygen. They were the proof that the world of color, of warmth, of life still existed somewhere beyond my circle of gray. She carried the weight of the debt with a quiet, uncomplaining grace that made me love her even more. She never once lamented the life we didn't have, the things we couldn't afford. "We're a team," she would write. "You're out there on the front line. I'm here managing the supply lines. Every payment we make, every day you're out there, we're one step closer, Stellan. I can feel it." Her strength was my strength. Her belief was my compass. This last tour had been the longest, 8 months. A new contract that offered a massive completion bonus, a final dragon-slaying payment that would, at long last, set us free. 8 months of the screaming engines, of the 24-hour North Sea gloom, of the recycled air and the recycled food, and the crushing monastic loneliness. I had pushed myself to the breaking point, taking on extra shifts, volunteering for the dirtiest, most dangerous maintenance jobs. I had a photograph of the house we were going to buy taped up next to hers in my locker. It was a small stone cottage with a wild, overgrown garden, a place where the only roaring sound would be the wind in the trees. It was the blueprint for our peace. I had endured it all with that image in my mind. The voyage home was a slow, agonizing decompression. As the shores of Scotland finally appeared on the horizon, a smudge of impossible green after months of gray, I felt a sense of triumphant, bone-weary relief that was so profound it was almost painful. The war was over. The dragon was dead. I was coming home, not for a brief, fleeting shore leave, but for good. I had enough money saved, with the bonus, to pay off the last of the debt and put a down payment on the cottage. I was 35 years old, and my life was, finally, about to begin. The first sign that the map I had been following was a lie was small, a detail I barely registered at the time. When I called Cora from the port in Aberdeen to tell her I was home, that I was safe, her voice on the phone was not the sound of pure, unadulterated joy I had been expecting. There was a strange, flustered, almost panicked note in her voice. You're back already?" she stammered. "The company said another week. I wasn't ready." "I took an early transport," I explained, my own excitement overriding the strange dissonance in her tone. "I'm on my way, my love. The war is over." There was a pause on the line, a beat of static that felt a little too long. "That's wonderful, Stellan," she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too forced. "I can't wait to see you." The journey from the port to our small apartment in the city was a dream. The colors of the world seemed impossibly vivid after the monochrome of the sea. The green of the grass, the red of the buses, the dizzy and chaotic variety of human faces. I was a man returning from the moon. I bought a bouquet of freesias at the train station, her favorite, their scent a powerful, forgotten memory of our life before the gray. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs to our apartment, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, joyful rhythm. I used my key, the key that felt strange and unfamiliar in my hand, and I opened the door. I was expecting to find her there, waiting for me. I was expecting to be enveloped in her arms, in the scent of her hair, in the warmth of the life I had come home to claim. The apartment was empty. It was neat, it was clean, but it was empty. A note was on the kitchen table, her familiar looping script on a piece of plain white paper. "Stellan," it read, "something has come up, a family emergency. I am so sorry. I had to go. I will call you tonight. I love you." A family emergency? The words were a bucket of ice water in my face. What family? Her parents were gone. She had no siblings. An aunt in the countryside she hadn't spoken to in years? The joy, the triumph, the sense of arrival, it all drained away, leaving a cold, hollow feeling in its place. I sat down at the small kitchen table, the ridiculously vibrant bouquet of freesias still in my hand. The apartment was silent, too silent. For 8 years, I had dreamed of this moment, the moment of return, and the reality of it was this: an empty room, a cryptic note, and a silence that was 1,000 times more lonely than the roar of the ship's engines. My eyes scanned the room, looking for something to hold on to, some proof that the life I had been fighting for was real. And then I saw it. On the small corkboard by the phone, where we used to pin ticket stubs and silly notes, was a photograph I had never seen before. It was a recent picture, taken at a park, the leaves on the trees the same shade of autumn gold as the ones outside my window. It was a picture of Cora. She was smiling, that beautiful, radiant smile. But she was not alone. She was standing next to an elderly couple, a frail-looking woman in a wheelchair and a stooped, white-haired man. Cora's arm was around the old woman's shoulders, a gesture of profound, familiar affection. And standing on the other side of the old man, his hand resting on his shoulder, was a young man in his early 20s with a startlingly familiar face. I stood up and walked to the board, my legs feeling unsteady. I looked closer at the photograph. The young man had the same dark, wild hair as Cora's father from the old picture she had shown me. But it was the old man who made my blood run cold. I knew his face. I had seen it in the one faded photograph Cora kept in a silver frame on her bedside table. The photograph of her first husband, the man who had died in a rock climbing accident just 6 months after they were married, years before she had met me. His name was Liam. The old man in the new photograph was Liam's father, the old woman his mother. And the young man, I realized with a sickening, gut-wrenching certainty, was his younger brother. The debt, the monster I had spent 8 years of my life fighting in the cold, gray hell of the North Sea, it was not a financial ledger from her parents. It was them. It was a ghost. And my wife had been feeding that ghost with the blood, sweat, and sacrifice of my life. The photograph was not just a picture. It was a Rosetta Stone. It was the key that translated the last 8 years of my life from a story of shared sacrifice into a language of profound, bottomless deception. Every email, every satellite call, every word of encouragement was now recast in the harsh, unflattering light of this new truth. The family emergency was not a lie. It was just not my family. The we she had always spoken of, the team I thought I was a part of, had never included me. The team was her and them, the family of the man she had lost. I was the silent, invisible partner, the offshore account that funded the entire enterprise. I sank back into the chair at the kitchen table, the photograph still in my hand. My mind, the engineer's mind, which was trained to deal with catastrophic system failures, was struggling to process a failure of this magnitude. The foundation of my entire world, the bedrock of my love and trust for Cora, had just been revealed as a lie. And the structure that had been built upon it, the life I thought we were working towards, was a phantom, a mirage. I was not a husband fighting for his wife's future. I was a tool, a means to an end. I was a ghost, haunting the periphery of a life dedicated to the memory of another man. The anger, when it came, was not a hot, explosive rage. It was a cold, quiet, and deeply terrifying thing. It was the cold of the North Sea itself, a cold that seeped into your bones and threatened to stop your heart. I sat there for hours as the light outside the window faded from the pale gray of the afternoon to the deep, inky black of night. The freesias in my hand began to wilt, their vibrant color a mocking counterpoint to the monochrome of my new reality. The phone finally rang around 10 o'clock. It was her. Her voice was a symphony of practiced concern and loving apology. "Stellan? Oh, thank God. I'm so sorry, my love. I'm so sorry. My aunt, the one in the countryside, she had a terrible fall. I had to rush down here. I'm at the hospital with her now. She's stable, but it's been a nightmare." The lie was so smooth, so effortless, so perfectly constructed. She had been rehearsing this story, this alternate reality, for years. The ease with which she deployed it was, in its own way, more painful than the lie itself. I held the photograph in my other hand, my thumb tracing the outline of the old man's face, the face of Liam's father. "Is she okay?" I asked, my voice a dead, flat monotone that I barely recognized as my own. The machine had taken over. The man who loved Cora, the man who was capable of being hurt by her, had retreated, leaving this cold, functional shell in his place. "She will be," Cora said, her relief at my unquestioning acceptance palpable even over the phone. But I might have to stay for a few days, just to get her settled. I feel so awful. This was supposed to be our time. It's okay, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Family is important. You're a good man, Stellan, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that I now knew was not love, but a toxic cocktail of guilt and gratitude. I'll be home as soon as I can. I love you. She hung up. I placed the phone back on its cradle. She loved me. She loved the money I sent. She loved the sacrifice I made. She loved the ghost I was, the ghost that allowed her to live her real life, a life where she could be the dutiful surrogate daughter-in-law to the parents of the man she had truly loved. The next morning, I began my investigation. I was no longer a husband waiting for his wife. I was a forensic engineer, examining the wreckage of a collapsed structure, trying to understand the point of failure. I started with the apartment. I looked at it with new eyes, not as my home, but as a crime scene. I searched for clues, for evidence of the life that had been hidden from me. I found it in a locked wooden chest at the foot of our bed, a chest she had always told me contained her childhood memories. I picked the cheap lock with a paperclip. It was not full of her memories. It was full of his. It was a shrine to Liam. There were photo albums filled with pictures of him and Cora, their faces young and full of a hope I had never seen in her eyes when she looked at me. There were his climbing journals, full of his handwriting, his thoughts, his dreams. There were bundled letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, love letters they had written to each other. I read one. It was a mistake. The intimacy of their words, the depth of their connection, was a form of violence. I felt like a voyeur, a trespasser. He was the poet, the adventurer, the man who had owned her heart in a way I never could. I was the engineer, the pragmatist, the man who had come after, the man who was paying for the upkeep of his memory. The most devastating discovery was a series of bank statements at the bottom of the chest. They were from a separate account, an account I had never known about. My wire transfers would come into our joint account, and a day later, an automatic transfer would move the exact same amount into this secret account. And from this account, the money flowed out. A monthly payment to a nursing home for premium care services, a quarterly tuition payment to a prestigious university for a Mr. Evan Albright, and regular, large cash withdrawals. The nursing home, I found with a quick search, was where Liam's parents lived. And Evan Albright, I knew from the back of one of the photographs, was the name of his younger brother. I was not just paying off a debt, I was funding their entire lives. I was paying for the comfort of his parents in their old age. I was paying for his brother's education. I was the silent, unknowing patron of the entire Albright family. The cold, quiet rage in my heart began to solidify, to take on a new, hard, and dangerously sharp edge. I had not just been lied to, I had been used. My life, my body, my very soul had been converted into currency to fund a monument to a dead man's love. I had to see it for myself. I had to see the house that Liam's parents lived in, the institution my sacrifice was paying for. The name of the nursing home was on the bank statements. It was an exclusive, expensive place on the coast, a place with ocean views and private gardens. I drove there. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to see the physical reality of my own folly. I parked across the street, and I watched. About an hour later, I saw her, Cora. She was not in the countryside with a sick aunt. She was here. She was pushing an elderly woman in a wheelchair through the perfectly manicured gardens. It was the woman from the photograph, Liam's mother. They were laughing. Cora was gently tucking a blanket around the old woman's legs. She looked happy. She looked at peace. She looked like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was not a wife, a lover, a partner. She was a daughter, and she was home. I sat in my car, a ghost watching from a distance, and I finally understood the full, terrible, and tragic scope of her deception. The debt she was paying was not a financial one. It was a debt of survivor's guilt. Liam had died saving her. He had fallen during a climb, pushing her out of the way of a rockfall that would have killed her. He had traded his life for hers, and she had spent the last decade of her life, and all of mine, trying to pay it back. Her marriage to me had been a means to an end. It was a business arrangement. I was the deep-sea oil rig, pumping out the raw material, the money, that she could then refine into a life for the family he had left behind. She had not betrayed me out of malice. She had betrayed me out of a love for him that was so profound, so all-consuming, that it had erased every other moral and ethical consideration. I was not her husband. I was a war reparation, and I had just, finally, finished paying the price. My rage was gone. The coldness was gone. All that was left was a vast, hollow emptiness. The feeling of a man who has finally reached his destination, only to find that the city on his map does not exist, and never did. I started the car, and I drove away. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew that I could not go back to the apartment. I could not go back to the sea. The two fixed points of my life had both been revealed as illusions. My compass was broken, and I was adrift on a new, far more terrifying ocean, with no map, no shore, and no idea which way to turn. The days that followed my flight from the nursing home were a period of deliberate, self-imposed exile. I did not leave the city. I simply disappeared into it. I checked into a cheap, anonymous hotel in a part of town I had never been to, a place of peeling paint and the distant, mournful sound of foghorns from the port. I paid in cash. I gave a false name. I became a ghost of my own making. I needed to be in dry dock. My entire life had been a vessel built for a single purpose, a single voyage. And that voyage was now over, the cargo delivered, the destination revealed as a phantom. The ship that was Stellan was now just a hollow, empty hull, and I needed to assess the damage, to see if it was even seaworthy anymore. I did not contact Cora. My phone remained off, a dead, silent brick in the bottom of my duffel bag. I knew she would be panicking. My disappearance would be a catastrophic complication to her carefully managed world. The money, her supply line, had been cut. But I felt no satisfaction in her anxiety. My actions were not a form of punishment. They were a form of survival. I could not speak to her because I did not know what to say. The language of our marriage, the language of shared sacrifice and a common goal, was now obsolete. And the new language, the language of her profound, all-consuming deception, was one I was not yet able to speak. My days took on a new, strange rhythm. I would wake up early and walk. I would walk for hours with no destination through the unfamiliar streets of the city I had only ever seen in brief, fleeting visits. I was a tourist in my own life. I would sit in anonymous cafes, nursing a single cup of coffee for hours, watching the tide of humanity ebb and flow around me. I was watching people live the kind of lives I had only ever seen in photographs. The small, mundane interactions of couples, the easy laughter of friends, the chaotic, beautiful mess of families. I was an alien, studying the customs of a foreign species. In the evenings, I would sit in my sterile motel room and I would think. I would deconstruct the last 8 years of my life with the methodical precision of an engineer analyzing a catastrophic structural failure. I went over every email, every phone call, every memory, but this time with the blueprint of the truth in my hand. I saw it all now, the clues I had missed, the tells I had ignored. Her constant, vague sadness, which I had attributed to the stress of our situation, was not stress, it was grief. A perpetual, unending grief for the man she had lost. Her disinterest in our own future, in the details of the cottage we were supposedly going to buy, was not a sign of her trust in me. It was a sign that our future was an abstract concept to her, a fiction she had to maintain. Her real future was inextricably tied to his past. The most painful part of the analysis was confronting my own willful blindness. The signs had always been there. The silver-framed photograph of him on her bedside table, a relic of a past love that was far more prominent than any picture of me. The way she would sometimes, in a moment of distraction, almost call me by his name, Liam, catching herself at the last second. I had seen these things. I had registered them as data points. But I had chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to file them away, to not see the pattern they formed. My love for her, my desperate need to believe in the story of us, had been a filter that had distorted the very reality I was living in. I had not been deceived. I had been a willing participant in the deception. And that was a truth that was, in many ways, harder to bear than the betrayal itself. I had to understand the man I had been replaced by. I had to understand the ghost whose legacy I had been funding. I went to the library and I began to research Liam Albright. I found the archives of old local newspapers. I found the article about the climbing accident. It was exactly as Cora had described it, but with one crucial detail she had always omitted. He had not just been a passionate amateur. He was a celebrated local hero, a semi-professional mountaineer who volunteered for the local search and rescue team. He had died during a training exercise, saving his team, including a young, inexperienced climber named Cora, from a rockfall. He hadn't just died saving his wife, he had died saving a member of his team. His death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a public one. He was a martyr, a saint, a man who had died in the act of selfless, heroic sacrifice. How could I, a simple, pragmatic engineer who spent his life in the gray, greasy world of a ship's engine room, ever compete with that? I was a man who prevented failures. He was a man who had died in a blaze of glory. His ghost was not just the ghost of a dead husband. It was the ghost of an ideal, a romantic, heroic ideal that I could never and would never be. And I understood then that Cora's actions were not just about guilt. They were about worship. She was the high priestess of the cult of Saint Liam. His parents were her sacred relics. His brother was the continuation of his line. And I was the collection plate, the man whose anonymous, grubby work funded the beautiful, pristine cathedral of his memory. This understanding brought a strange, bitter kind of peace. It was not a matter of me not being good enough. It was a matter of me being the wrong species entirely. I could no more be Liam Albright than a draft horse could be a soaring eagle. We were built for different elements. One day, sitting in a waterfront park, watching the container ships being loaded at the port, a thought occurred to me. A simple, practical engineer's thought. I had spent 8 years working to pay off a debt, and I had succeeded. The debt, whatever its nature, was paid. The contract was fulfilled. My service was, for all intents and purposes, over. So what now? What does a tool do when its job is finished? Does it lie in the toolbox forever, waiting for a task that will never come? Or does it choose a new function? I thought about the money, my money. The money I had earned with the slow, grinding sacrifice of my own youth, my own life. I had never once thought of it as mine. It had always been a tribute, an offering. But it was mine. I had the bank statements. I had the record of every single wire transfer. I had the proof. A different man, a man driven by rage, by a need for revenge, would have used that proof as a weapon. He would have hired a lawyer. He would have sued her for fraud. He would have destroyed her, destroyed the Albright family, exposed her beautiful, tragic lie to the cold, harsh light of the law. He would have demolished her cathedral. But what would that achieve? It would not bring back my lost years. It would not heal my heart. It would only create more wreckage. It would hurt the 2 old people in the nursing home. It would derail the future of the young man at the university. It would turn Cora from a flawed, tragic figure into a cornered, desperate animal. It would be a victory that tasted of ashes. There had to be another way, a quieter way, a way that was not about destruction, but about balance. A way to reclaim not the money, but myself. The idea, when it came, was simple, elegant, and in its own way absolutely final. It was a blueprint for a new kind of structure, a structure built not on a shared past, but on a separate and equal future. I took out my phone and turned it on for the first time in a week. There was a flood of frantic messages from Cora. Voicemails, texts. Where are you? Are you okay? Please, Stellan, please just call me. I ignored them. I made one call, to a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, a trust and estate lawyer. I gave him my instructions. They were simple. I wanted to set up an irrevocable trust. The beneficiary of the trust was to be the Albright family, the parents and the younger brother. The trust would be funded by a single lump sum payment. The amount of that payment was to be exactly 50% of every dollar I had earned in the last 8 years. I was, in essence, formalizing my role. I was paying them, in full, for the life of my wife. In return, I wanted one thing: a clean, legal, and final severance. The other 50%, my half, was to be transferred to a new account, in my name only. I was cutting the supply line. I was closing the account. I was, in the quiet, brutal language of finance, liquidating the partnership. The lawyer was confused, but the instructions were clear. The paperwork was drawn up. The transfers were made. My final act was to write a single, short email to Cora. I attached the legal documents for the trust. The email itself contained only 2 sentences. The debt is paid. You are free. I hit send, and then I turned off my phone. I walked out of the hotel, my single duffel bag over my shoulder. I was no longer a ghost. I was no longer a tool. I was just a man with half a fortune he had never intended to have, and a life he had never intended to live. I walked towards the port. The foghorns were calling. The sea was calling. But this time, I was not going back as a worker. I was going as a passenger. I was going to buy a ticket on the first ship leaving, going anywhere. My long, terrible, and strangely noble voyage was over, and a new one was about to begin. The act of sending that final email was like throwing a master switch, cutting power to a machine that had been running loudly and inefficiently for 8 years. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with a new, strange, and terrifying sense of possibility. I had severed the connection. I had paid the toll. I was, for the first time in my adult life, a man with no obligations, no destination, and no one to answer to but myself. I stood at the port, a place that had always been a point of departure for a life of grueling work, and I saw it now as a gateway. The ships in the harbor were no longer just cargo vessels. They were options, each one a potential future, a different direction on a map that was now completely, exhilaratingly blank. I did not buy a ticket on the first ship. That would have been an impulse, an act of running. And I was done running. My life up until this point had been a series of reactions. A reaction to the debt, a reaction to the lie, a reaction to the truth. Now, for the first time, I had the opportunity to make a proactive choice, to plot a course based not on what I was leaving, but on what I might be sailing toward. I spent a week in that port city. I found a small, clean room in a guest house overlooking the water, and I began the slow, quiet work of getting to know the stranger who was myself. I had spent so long defining myself by my role, provider, husband, worker, that I had no idea who Stellan was without those titles. I discovered he was a man who liked the quiet of the early morning, the taste of strong black coffee, and the feeling of the sun on his face. I discovered he was a man who was interested in the intricate art of shipbuilding, in the history of the old fishing vessels that lined the harbor. I spent my days in maritime museums and libraries, not because I had to, but because I wanted to.
I was, for the first time, following the compass of my own curiosity. I did not hear from Cora. My lawyer handled the final legal mechanics of our separation. He told me that she had accepted the terms without contest. The trust had been established. The Albright family's future was secure. Our marriage was dissolved with the quiet, anticlimactic stroke of a judge's pen. I felt a sense of profound, melancholy relief. I had not destroyed her. I had, in a strange way, given her exactly what she wanted: the freedom to dedicate her life to the memory of the man she loved, without the burdensome lie of being married to me. I had paid for her to be a full-time widow. It was a strange and strangely fitting conclusion to our story. My own story, however, was just beginning. After a month of quiet contemplation, I knew I couldn't stay on land. The sea was in my blood. The rhythm of the waves, the vast open horizon. It was the only landscape where my soul felt at home. But I could not go back to the gray prison of the supply ships. That was a life of servitude. I wanted a life of freedom. I used a portion of my money, my half, to buy a boat. It was not a new or a fancy vessel. It was an old, sturdy 30-foot sailboat, a boat that had seen storms and survived, a boat with good bones and a history etched into its weather-teak deck. I named her the Compass. For the next year, I worked on her. I did not hire a crew. I did the work myself. I scraped the hull. I mended the sails. I learned the intricate language of her rigging. I poured all of my engineer skill, all of my pent-up focus, into the project of making her seaworthy. The boat became my new purpose, my new partner. It was an honest relationship. She demanded my attention, my respect, my hard work, and in return, she offered me the promise of a new kind of freedom. The day I finally sailed out of that harbor, I did not have a destination. I had a direction: south, towards the sun, towards the warmth, towards a world of color I had only ever dreamed of. The life I live now is quiet. It is simple. It is mine. I sail from port to port, taking on odd jobs, a bit of engine repair, some short-haul cargo transport, enough to keep my vessel and myself supplied. I have seen more of the world in the last 2 years than I saw in a lifetime of professional seafaring. I have seen sunsets in the Aegeans that were the color of crushed apricots. I have tasted fish in a small Portuguese village that was cooked with a simplicity that would make a master chef weep. I have learned to speak a broken, functional Spanish and a little bit of Greek. I am no longer a man defined by a single, all-consuming sacrifice. I am a man defined by a series of small, chosen moments. I still think of Cora. I do not hate her. The anger has long since been weathered away by the sun and the salt. I think of her as a character in a book I read a long time ago, a story of a woman trapped by a love so powerful it became a kind of madness. I hope she has found her peace, in the quiet, manicured gardens of that nursing home, in the life she chose. I have found mine, out here, in the vast, unpredictable, and beautiful emptiness of the sea. My sacrifice was not in vain. It bought an education for a young man I will never meet. It bought comfort for 2 old people in their final years. And it bought my wife the freedom to live her truth, as painful and as strange as that truth was. But it also, in the end, bought me something I never knew I was missing. It bought me my own life. I had to travel to the end of a lie, to the very edge of the map of my own heart, to finally discover that the most important voyage is the one where you are your own and only destination. Thank you for tuning in to Reddit Whispers. We've all faced moments when everything felt broken. What was your turning point? Leave it in the comments, because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear.